this computer. Welcome everyone to the weekly Cluster API Provider Azure office hours. Today is September 1st, 2022. We are a CNCF sponsored project, which means that we respect the code of conduct. Be nice to one another, please. Raise your hands, and generally, let's have fun and be communal and move the project forward. So at the beginning of the meeting, we like to give folks a chance to introduce themselves. I am looking, and maybe there are a few folks that I haven't seen before. You certainly don't have to say hi, but you're welcome to say hi now. So I'll take a second if folks want to introduce themselves.
I'll say hi. My name is Jansen Alfin. I'm a cloud engineer at Adobe, co-worker with Mike Tugeron. So just listening in today.
Welcome, Jansen. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Mago, this is Steve. I'm from Microsoft. I'm part of our Cloud Native and App Innovation Global Black Belt team. So I work with customers to build solutions around AKS, and so yeah, I want to get involved.
Welcome, Steve. Okay, cool. So for I'll just reiterate a recent change we've done to the meeting. So this will be a little bit of housekeeping, but we're now doing this every week. So in the past, we've done this bi-weekly, every other week. So we're doing this more frequently. Hopefully that sort of unlocks the value of this meeting to folks who want sort of more real-time status updates or want to bring things to the attention and don't have to wait so long. And then we're also doing this now. We're here, so we know this, but this is an hour later than we've been conventionally doing it for the past year or two. So for folks maybe looking at the recording, that might explain why they came at the wrong time or they missed this meeting. So I hope that's going well for folks. We can discuss that in open topics if we want. Okay, so I'm going to go through the recurring topics section here, and it looks like folks are adding themselves to the attendee list. So I think we're at the point where we can look at the milestone review, which is actually pertinent because our targeted release date for our next minor release is next week. Maybe a slight digression. I don't see this in the sort of formal outline here, but just a reminder that we did release earlier this week based on consensus during last Thursday's office hours. We released 1.4.2. I'm taking that from memory, but I think that's right. Which has, thank you, Cecile, which has a few fixes, and really encouragingly, all those fixes were from the community. So thanks everybody for those fixes. Thank you for your endurance during a period before those were actually in place, because that means that there was a little suffering involved. But it's really, really cool to see the community being the one to bring this stuff into the project. So yeah, get 1.4.2 if any of those issues affect you. So if I open up a new tab, I wonder if that will, my screen share will honor that. Do we get the CapZ PR queue at this point in screen share?
Yep.
Cool, cool. All right, so I think I want to click here. Nope. Maybe the easiest way is to go and do this.
At the top, next to labels. Yep.
I see. Okay, that's an easier way to enter. Okay, cool. So 1.5 is, as it says here, we're planning to ship or at least do some release testing on September 7th. So we've got just a few more days in the dev cycle before this lands. And this list is looking nice and small. So for folks who haven't been looking at this over time, this might still seem like, oh, there's still stuff. But in fact, this was a lot larger in the recent past. So I'm delighted to see it so small. Cecile, is this, and other folks, is this a good time to maybe officially move these to vNext? Or just to at least go through one by one and evaluate for that criteria? Go ahead, Cecile.
I think we don't have an official code phrase or anything like that. Maybe that's something we want to introduce in the future. So we don't merge huge refactors or features right before the release. For the first one and the last one, I think it would be reasonable to get them into the next milestone since they're not close to merging, either of them. The second one, I'll leave that up to Matt. I don't know if that's something he was planning on doing this week.
No,
or-
I'm still planning to do it. I have a couple days left.
So
Touche.
probably just keep the second one.
Okay, cool. Well, let's just go through a little bit of formality. So I will allow folks while I'm clicking through all the fun buttons, flat car sport for Cap Z. If you have any objections, if you know anything that we don't in terms of this being super ready to merge in the next couple of days, please speak up. Otherwise, my understanding of the scope of this is that a few days is not long enough to complete this and get.
Mateus had a comment at the very end of it, but I think it's about a
Well,
week old.
Let's go ahead and look at that comment.
Yeah. Oh, well, maybe 2 weeks old. So probably not going to happen, I'm guessing.
Okay, let's see. Is this a thing that has status? Is it closed? Okay, cool. So since this is open, I assume this is something to the effect of progress in Cap Z is blocked on this. I'm just going to get some. Oops, I lost my. I'm going to get some clarity as a part of this. Is this a useful way of using time in this meeting? This is kind of like real-time issue triage. If this seems overly inside baseball and boring, I'm open to those thoughts. Otherwise, the benefit is being able to get real-time input from the community. Okay, so I'm going to mark this as next. Okay, great. So it looks like you only get one milestone per issue. That seems sane. And Matt, this is assigned to you, and you are thumbs up on being able to finish this the next few days. Great, thank you. So I'll click through to this. I think there is an open PR for this, and is there an open PR for this? Okay, cool. So this probably needs a rebase. It actually doesn't need a rebase, but I'll just leave a brief comment on here. Is this the issue? Yeah. So this is Dane submitted the issue, and then Brian looks like he's implementing the actual functionality here. Does anybody want to advocate that we create a 1.6 milestone now, or do that next week after we land 105?
Is that part of the release process? I think it is.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's part of the release process usually. But I mean, no objection to creating it now if we think it's useful.
Yeah.
We should definitely do it at least when we do the next release.
Yeah, well, let's check out I'm kind of inclined to want to give folks at least an opportunity to participate in that, because there's a lot of sort of real-time yay nay kind of stuff that goes on. I want to look at it does seem like we have some agenda items, so let's not do this now, would be my vote. And as part of the release process, let's I think Matt, at least you and I will be involved in that. Let's say a couple hours before announce an ad hoc Zoom where we can do 1.6 milestone. We can just do that work. Maybe it's 15 minutes or whatever, and give folks who are following us on Slack the opportunity to hang out and offer any feedback. Cool. And maybe we can go through that this time and take note of how that goes and maybe incorporate what we do more formally into the release document itself for the next time. So, okay, cool. This has been a really good milestone. 77 closed issues. That's like a lot. That's really good. Great job, everybody. And there's gonna obviously be probably a little bit more that gets into the release, but this is like everything here was purposefully tagged as part of the 1.5 milestones. That's a lot of purposeful achievement. All right, so cool. Open discussion time. So we've announced 142. It looks like Ashutosh, you are first up with Kubernetes control plane node taint changes in 1.24. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so before 1.24, it was /master, and as part of migration from master to control plane, this is the taint that's being used. So, I've also realized that we don't have any toleration in CAPZ deployment for master nodes. Usually, it's not the case when the manager pod should get scheduled to, or we want to schedule them to master nodes. But I just wanted to, hear feedback and opinions, because I've seen, cases where there are single Kubernetes node deployments. And also I was talking to Nadir regarding, some of the works that they did in AWS to reduce the security boundaries. For example, those nodes have, higher security privileges. And so we may want to schedule CAPZ to control plane nodes only and not on other worker nodes.
Cool. So I have a quick question. Do we have anything that we currently support that has the old toleration? So is this like a back compat question, or is this more of a open question?
Yeah, it's an open question. I don't know what's the right way. I just happen to know that I was just exploring other providers and saw that our deployment does not mention any toleration. As if you see into other providers, or if you see CAPI, they mention tolerations onto their deployment spec. So just wanted to bring this to light. So what would be like? What do you all think about this? I don't have an answer right now, but just wanted to, because this is what I just figured out today, and I saw that we don't have a toleration for that. So that means if we inherently deploy CAPZ in a single not Kubernetes cluster, that means the pod would be pending. Or does that make sense?
I think it does, and we're mostly talking about self-managed clusters where the management components are running on the workload cluster. So it's after a pivot. Is that right? Or are we talking about your management cluster running 124, not being able? I see. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Cecile has her hands up. So thank you for clarifying that. That does make sense to me, Ashutosh. Go ahead, Cecile.
Yeah, I don't have an answer. I just want to say that I've also noticed this in the past, that we're kind of the only odd one out. Like Cluster API definitely has a toleration on the control planes, but CAPZ doesn't. And that's something I noticed when I was testing with Stefan, the bug that was affecting, basically like private clusters in Azure that only had one node, and where the Kubernetes control plane controller was running on the control plane and it was trying to route to itself.
Yes.
And as a workaround, we just added it temporarily on the fly, but I don't think it would be a bad thing to add it always in the manager definition. So I'm +1, I think, to adding it.
Yeah, and that issue that you were talking about, Cecil, we also faced sometime back. That's mostly regarding NAT hairpinning. So I think if we do this, we will also need to kind of, I don't know what's the fix to figure out a way to solve that. Like, because now the control plane components I mean, the manager deployments for CAPE and CAPZ may get scheduled to a control plane node, which has the load balancer itself.
Okay, cool. So this is interesting to me. I have been totally ignorant of this. I would imagine that's the way that I run tests. Typically, in build clusters for development relies on kind, and so I'm inferring that my kind cluster has been always running 123 or below. So I've never observed this. And same thing for
kind,
CI.
Kind will intentionally not put this taint on the nodes. So even if you use 1.24, you're good.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, this seems like a totally idiomatic thing. My only thought is, do we want to add the previous toleration as well for clusters because I know that this is sort of the exclusive taint in 124 and above, but there are lots of, say, 122 clusters in the wild that also have this taint. Basically, there's a mix between the control plane and the master syntax being part of the taint. So if we're going to add support for this, should we add support for the deprecated one just to cover pre-124 scenarios as well?
Makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So. So I know I just talked about the 1.5 milestone, but this seems like something that we would actually want to include in 1.5. Ashutosh, could you file an issue for this? And I think that we can get sufficient test coverage, and we'll find someone to do the implementation. It's probably not that much work. Does that sound controversial, what I just said, to anyone?
No, Cecile has hand raised, so.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to answer the thing that Ashutosh said before, but no objection from me to what Jack just said. Does anyone else have anything about that? Or I can circle back afterwards.
Isn't it just like changing the deployment spec for CAPG manager? Like just have it should be a little PR, right? Like
it should be a very small PR.
Yeah. So Jack, do you still want me to just open up an issue, or just opening a PR to do the work? What do you think?
I mean, if you want to do the PR, that'd be delightful. But the issue would be great. Then it'll just move this into, it'll set things in motion. And to clarify, if we find out that it's more work, I mean, that seems very, very unlikely. We're not going to block 1.5 on this, I don't anticipate. But yeah, and because this isn't like an intrinsic part of CAPZ, it's more best practice I would imagine that the way that we define the deployment in our repository is a sort of reference that probably lots of folks in the real world are actually using as is. But also having the issue will help folks who are running into this patch their existing environments, because it's not that hard of a thing to do. A user wouldn't be blocked on this landing in our reference deployment in the repo.
Cool. I'll do ISO plus PR. So thanks.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much, Ashutosh.
So just to circle back on what we were saying before with the issue with the private clusters. So doing this does create a risk where if a user has a single control plane, so they just have one, and so their connections are 100% failing because it's routing to itself, and that control plane has a private endpoint, which means it's going to run into the famous Azure hairpin routing issue. It's going to cause your deployment to not work, like your cluster API control plane deployment to not work. But in any other scenario where there's more than one control plane, we did end up implementing a fix in cluster API so that when it detects that the first time, it will switch to using the internal cluster config. So it doesn't actually go outside and reroute the control plane. It will just directly talk to itself, which does fix that issue pretty reliably. So just wanted to just point that out. So this is only the case when there's going to be only one control plane that is going to run into that issue. Sorry, maybe that's kind of in the weeds for everyone who doesn't have context.
Yeah, maybe Cecil, I'll write this one into the issue for the record so that.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah.
That will help.
Cool. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks.
James, before we move on, go ahead.
Sorry, so does that mean that you cannot run CAPZ on a single node cluster then?
If the-
124.
It's not 124. It's all it doesn't have like
Oh, it doesn't have the old
all
toleration
Kubernetes
either.
version. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
it does if that single node is a private load balancer endpoint. So if it's public, it will work. It's just if it's a private internal load balancer.
Maybe
I
we
don't
can add
actually
that into the-
understand that. Does anybody else not understand that? If it's just me, I can.
Probably a lot of people. This is very deep. Okay, so just to give a high level overview, in Azure, there's this networking, it's not a bug, it's by design, where if you have an internal load balancer, any backend member of that load balancer, so any VM that's in that internal load balancer backend cannot route to itself. So if it goes and makes a request to the internal IP of the load balancer, and that request ends up getting routed back to that same VM, that will fail. That means if you have a single VM in an internal load balancer, which makes requests to the internal IP, it will fail 100% of the time because it won't be able to route back to itself. So that's kind of what we're talking about. If you
Well,
have,
what is that? I guess I don't understand how that ties into taints and tolerations.
so it's because if you're not running the manager on the control plane, because there is no toleration, you're never going to run into that issue because it's never going to be coming from a VM that's inside the internal LB when it reaches the API
Oh,
server.
I see. So there's essentially an edge case in Azure where internal or private clusters, whatever you want to call those, clusters where the control plane is running behind a private private IP load balancer. There's actually no way to schedule workloads on those control plane nodes.
There is, it's just like those workloads can be calling the API server. So the CAPZ manager, to clarify, the CAPZ controller will be fine. CAPZ control, so adding this toleration won't actually cause this issue to happen. This issue is already happening with the cluster API controllers. So the one that it's affecting is the kubeadm control plane controller, because that's the one that checks the health of the API server. And it can't check the health of the API server since reaching the API server fails.
If it's scheduled onto it, so it has to be scheduled onto a worker node, not a.
Right, or
And
it has to be a multi-control plane. If it's a single, because if it's multi-control plane, we implemented a workaround where it knows how to not go out to itself. But if
Got
it's
it.
a single control plane, it's going to fail 100% of the time, and it has no way to even check where it's running.
I think that's edge case enough that
Yeah.
it's probably just
So
worth
this
a note.
only just to, yeah, TLDR, this only affects the cluster API controller on a single node private control plane.
Yeah,
So
and
not
that
affecting
too.
CAPZ.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
go
that
ahead,
too,
Ashutosh.
even if we don't add this in CAPZ, we'll get affected because of the CAPI thing. So
Exactly.
yeah, so like Cecil was mentioning, this KCP part, it just if it gets scheduled on that only node, and if it tries to reach the API server, it won't, and then it will report unhealthy CD and all the API components and things would fail.
But to be clear, what we're saying is that once we implement this fix, that's you're enumerating a single edge case that this fix will bring along with it. No.
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 This happens now, it will happen after this change. It's a kind of tangent issue.
You're just pointing out that this won't fix that. That there's an
Yes.
edge case that this won't solve.
It won't make it worse, it won't make it better.
Right. And so you were just clarifying for folks who think that, okay, this will fix my ILB single control plane node issue. You're just saying, no, actually it won't.
Yeah, I
Fix that.
mean, yeah, it's more that the reason we noticed this in the first place was because we were investigating this other issue in CAPI. So yeah, nothing to worry about here. It's just, this is an independent, unrelated issue.
Okay, cool. Well, it's worth just stating that for the record because we're being
Yeah.
recorded for all time. So. Okay, cool.
Thanks, Cecil.
Clear as mud. Thanks, Ashutosh. Anyone have any further commentary on this? All right, cool. Mike, you are on deck and now you're up.
Yeah, so just a quick question about feature parity with VNet creation between AKS and non-AKS clusters. Notice with the non-AKS, you can do things like VNet peering, but with AKS, you cannot. Before we started diving into feature requests and associated PRs, just wanted to touch base to make sure there wasn't some sort of particular reason why that wasn't in place. So we didn't dive down a rabbit hole and then poke our heads up in a couple of weeks and realize that, hey, there's some reason why we shouldn't go down that rabbit hole. Or if that's a good feature that we should.
You know, it's a great question. I'm waiting for, does anybody want to raise hands and answer that? Go ahead, Cecile.
No reason particularly, just that no one ever asked for it and it was never implemented.
Okay, and a quick follow-up to that, what about features such as part of VNet creation, private links to things like, you know, blob storage and Cosmos and things like that? Would that be considered part of VNet creation, or would that be out of scope of that kind of functionality?
Ashtosh?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the question. So you're saying that as part of creating the VNet, can we create all the other storage stuff that we just talked about?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So when we create VNets outside of, you know, CAPZ right now, we basically create a VNet and the private links that are part of that VNet, so that we have that private connection to those, you know, private services with inside that VNet, so it doesn't have to go out of the VNet and then back in, or back to Azure after going out of the VNet. So I was just curious if that was considered outside the scope of a VNet creation, or as part of CAPZ, or if that would be considered potentially in scope.
So I'll take a stab at that one, and then I wanted to ask a clarifying question about the previous thing. I would imagine that would just be essentially an additive bit of functionality that a user would declare in the in either in the Azure Managed Control Plane, probably in the Azure Managed Control Plane, maybe the Azure cluster, to define a private link configuration that would work with the specified VNet configuration. So it would probably be a sibling configuration to the VNet configuration, and they would be expected to work well together.
Essentially, yeah.
So that sounds completely doable. Like, that's just work, I think, just to implement that bit of reconciliation during cluster creation time that makes sure that the declared private link spec is set up for the VNet, whether it's a bring your own VNet, or, I mean, maybe in a bring your own VNet scenario, you would want to already have that private link defined. But in the case where CAPZ is creating the VNet at runtime when the cluster creates, and if you want to define, say, okay, you're going to create a new VNet for me to host this cluster, I also want you to establish this private link configuration to these pre-existing, you know, VNet endpoints, and that should be totally doable. I wanted to ask a clarifying question. Cecile and Steve, do you want to talk to what I just said? In which case, I'll go to the back of the line.
Sort of.
Go
I
for it,
wanted
Cecile.
to ask Mike so I'm not too familiar with the private links. What makes you think it would not be in scope? I guess what's the reason you're bringing up this question? What makes you doubt that it would be?
I would think that it would be. I just wasn't sure since it wasn't there. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing something just from a lack of familiarity thing.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Steve?
Yeah, so typically when I work with customers that are building out like this, I mean, generally if it's a pre-existing VNet, they've gone and when you create the VNet, you would create those private links, or at the time that you determine you're going to deploy a private link to the VNet, then you work with the networking team. I've not run into cases where if you're provisioning an AKS cluster, it would, at cluster creation, if you're not bringing your own VNet, if you're letting AKS provision it, that it would go and pre-create those private links. I haven't seen that. So yeah, but traditionally it's something that's kind of pre-configured at VNet creation time.
James?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've played with the private links, but if you're doing a private link into like Key Vault or something, does the Key Vault need to exist prior to the private link being set up? And if so, I just worry a little bit about the edge boundary of like how far do we go down adding all of the things. And so yeah, I think that would be my one concern there, but I haven't played with them in a while. So.
Mike?
Yeah, so it wouldn't be like a private link to a specific key vault or to a specific blob storage. It's to the blob service provider or the key vault provider is my understanding of how it works, or at least that's the way we currently do it now. We currently set up, to like 10 or 12 different Azure providers, even though we don't may not use them. We set them up so that our tenants could potentially use them to connect to their blob storage using that private connection instead of the public connection. But yeah, it definitely wouldn't be for the bring your own VNet situation. A bring your own VNet would expect those things to already be created before when CapZ is managing those VNets is what I was thinking.
So Mike, you're already doing this in your AKS environments now without CapZ, where you allow AKS to create the VNet for you, and then you define all the private link things after the cluster is up with the VNet.
No, AKS is a new thing for us.
Got it.
So we're looking to migrate from VM based to AKS. We're doing this in a VM style environment, not with CapZ, but we're trying to figure out what all we can do with CapZ versus the way that we're doing it in our old legacy approach. And this is just a feature parity thing that we're like, okay, is this something we need to manage outside of CapZ, or is this something that, this is something that we felt seemed to be in scope of CapZ, and is this functionality that we can go ahead and create the issue and create the PRs to add that functionality in? Just wanted to sanity check that, everybody else felt that this is potentially in scope of the project, so that we didn't do the work and found out that, oh, hey, the opinion was setting up a private link to those Azure services was outside the scope of CapZ.
Definitely, I would say it's nothing that is actually working. Nothing that you can do is outside of the scope of CapZ. I actually don't know if you can do this. I don't know if AKS VNet privileges would allow you, if you defer the VNet to the AKS service. Maybe Steve can answer this, if it's even possible.
Yeah, so AKS today wouldn't do this for you. It would be a step outside of AKS cluster creation. So if you're creating an ARM template, this wouldn't be part of like the AKS resource provider or anything like that.
But it's possible to do after. It's possible to add after you.
Yeah, it's you're essentially kind of enabling that VNet for these services to link into, right?
So that's totally something that CapZ could do. Go ahead, Cecile.
So CapZ already pre-creates the VNet before creating the AKS cluster anyways. So technically from an AKS perspective, it is a pre-created VNet. It's just that whether that is pre-created by the user before using CapZ or by CapZ before calling AKS APIs, that's the difference. So CapZ is essentially automating the pre-creation on the user's behalf. So we wouldn't have to rely on AKS at all for this.
So what you're saying is that every AKS cluster built by CapZ is, from an AKS perspective, a bring your own VNet scenario.
Yes.
Got it. Cool. Yeah. So I mean, Mike, it's a really great macro question because it actually speaks to to me the most like foundational part of the CapZ value proposition with AKS. Like this is exactly what CapZ does. So I think it's our job to like add more and more so folks sort of get that. Like that's why folks will probably want to use CapZ on top of AKS, is because they're currently managing complex environments where they defer some of that to AKS, and then they do a whole host of dozens of other things on top of it to make their environments work. So the value proposition of CapZ is that we can matriculate all those custom things that folks are doing into the CapZ template. So you have one point of configuration and enforcement. Steve?
Yeah, just one more quick point. One challenge you might encounter, we'll have to look to address is, in larger enterprise customers, in a lot of cases, the network resources, the VNets, are kind of pre-created and locked down. So in those cases, it might be a little more challenging to enable this, but it's just something we'll have to think through how that would work, because it's like a lockdown Azure Active Directory resource that you'd have to grant access to in order to enable these things. So, but that again, that's more the BYO VNet scenario. So,
yeah, all that stuff just needs to be a part of the configuration criteria, so that all the possible scenarios, and if there are things where we're talking about passing secrets into the configuration in plain text, like that's obviously something that would require a deeper dive, because we can't do that. But okay, cool. Thanks, Mike. I'm gonna lower my hand. It's a little hard when I'm hosting. Do you feel you've been heard?
Yeah, no, definitely we got what we need to go forward. Jansen and I will take a cut at the feature issue and then start taking a cut at PRs.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Okay, Matt, looks like a classic open discussion with a never mind at the end. So that means we're not going to talk about it, or are we going to talk about it?
No, I don't think we need to. It would go off in the weeds, and also I answered most of my own questions just by looking at the issue, so we can skip.
Can I give a background to folks who are curious? So we yesterday, I don't know what the actual issue was, but the important thing is that we lost test coverage for certain parts of our test signal for a while, and I just wanted to ask, has that been restored? We did some work yesterday, and I haven't looked. Are we good? James was the first person to notice it. Did you check out this morning?
Yeah, at least the SIG Windows main jobs recovered.
Okay,
so I think
great.
Whatever change we rolled back fixed our test signal.
Cool.
And I think Mark is looking into the root cause this morning. So.
Yeah, I'll get with
Cool.
Mark. Obviously, I have some ideas.
Awesome. Well, shout out to you, James, for noticing that quickly so we could fix it, and shout out to Mark for
yes, somebody else pointed it out to me.
We'll just pass it forward all the way down. Okay, cool. All right, Cecile, you wanted to do a release check-in. So we talked about it a little bit, but go ahead, add whatever additional.
Yeah, this is also a never mind item, I think. Sorry, I added that before we went into the milestone at the beginning. I just wanted to check where we were at for the release, if there were any blockers. I'm going to be out for the next 2 weeks, so just wanted to see if everyone, like Matt, Jack, and other maintainers who are going to be involved felt good about having all the tools you needed for the release, or if there was anything I could help with before I leave.
Yeah, well, I think the community will make sure that all the fires for the next 9 months will happen in the next 2 weeks, so that by the time you get back, you can have a restful sort of 6 months. We'll take care of everything while you're gone. Cool. So William, you want to talk about machine pool provider ID lists?
Yeah, so this has been an issue that I've been looking into, and we kind of made an update on it, so I just wanted to give an update. So basically, every run of the end-to-end test will have an error message about failing to get logs from a machine, and this is yeah, that's me. So basically, we had what we discovered was it's trying to grab logs from a machine that doesn't exist. And then we found that there's a test that scales down the machine pool by 1 machine, but then it's in the cordon and drain test, but there's we're not actually testing the cordon and drain part, and found out that that test was actually removed a few months ago because it was flaky. So this scale down test actually doesn't test anything. So, but I did try to add to wait for the provider ID list to match the number of replicas, but it would never match for some reason. So I thought there was maybe an issue with how machine pools are handled, but when Jack and I were testing this manually, and we just observed a little latency, but nothing like too crazy. So we just figured that I think the best use of our time is to just re-implement the the cordon and drain test, and maybe it's just a weird issue with this test because I think we have another test that tests like scaling up and down, and that passes. So that's just the update for this situation. We're just going to disable the test for now and then write a better one.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for that PSA. So for folks who are concerned about a bunch of deleted test signal in our end-to-end, there's a reason behind it. Does anyone have any questions? Cool. We may be able to give folks back 14 minutes, but certainly we're all still here. Anybody want to bring anything up in real time, ad hoc, feel free to raise hand. Okay, see folks online.
Thanks,
Have a
Jack.
good one. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.